Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're talking about Deuteronomy chapter 24, 25, 26, and 27. And tomorrow we're going to get to Deuteronomy 28 and 29. It's only 2 chapters tomorrow because chapter 28 is very long. So we're going to dive right in. Chapter 24 talks about marriage and divorce laws. Now the first 4 verses here, it presupposes that divorce is actually permitted in Israel, but they leave the circumstance of that permission open-ended. They don't really specify whether it really was or not. This led to some controversy. Now, the word for something indecent that's in this verse, one of these verses, is not explained, although we find it again in verse 15, and that's where the controversy starts. This led to the Jewish controversy Jesus speaks to in Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 through 9, when the Pharisees asked Jesus about divorce. And of course he refers to these verses, but Jesus changes things on them a bit. He says something a little bit different. We'll get to that. The point of the verses here is that a man may not remarry a woman that he has divorced if she has previously remarried and then been widowed or divorced again. No reason was given for this prohibition, but perhaps it might have been used to discourage a man from just divorcing his wife on a whim and then later realize, maybe I shouldn't have divorced her, I think I'll remarry her. It's to kind of prevent that from happening. And the point of the divorce certificate was just to prove that the woman was free to remarry. And she was only defiled in the sense of not being able to remarry her first husband. And that was it. The issue here in this section really isn't divorce. The issue is really remarrying someone that you had divorced. That's really what the issue is here. Then we get into the section called Safeguarding a Life. And in verse 6 of chapter 24, it says, "Do not take a pair of grindstones or even the upper millstone as security for a debt, because that is like taking a life as security." Now, basically, that's referring to these grindstones that they would use to grind their food up with. If someone took that as collateral, then the person wouldn't be able to make any food. They could starve to death. So that's basically saying don't take an item that is essential to a person's well-being as collateral. That's for debtors. Don't do that. We get to the next section, verses 10 through 22, and they are about consideration for people in need. Chapter 25, we move on to fairness and mercy, and then preserving the family line. Now, in verse 5, it says, "When brothers live on the same property, and one of them dies without a son, the wife of the dead man may not marry a stranger outside the family. Her brother-in-law is to take her as his wife, have sexual relations with her, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law for her. The first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so his name will not be blotted out from Israel." Now, passing a man's name along to future generations was so important back then that if a man should die without a son, his widow was to attempt to have a son by one of her brother-in-laws. This was called the levirate custom, which is from the word levir, meaning brother-in-law. And we'll read more about this in Ruth, chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. Now we get to honest weights and measures in verse 13. And this is all about balance. And it's all about being, again, fair and showing kindness and honesty. It says in verse 13, "Do not have differing weights in your bag, one heavy and one light. Do not have differing dry measures in your house, a larger and a smaller. You must have a full and honest weight and full and honest dry measure." Now, this is referring to when people would actually go to the market to sell their goods. Sometimes the people who are using a balance scale or a scale to weigh the stuff they were buying, they would put on a heavier weight if they wanted to buy more of something for a lower price, because it would take more of that product to balance the scale out, but the weight would be labeled a smaller amount than it really was. So they would be getting twice as much of the product for the price of half of the product. So that was a way they would cheat people. So it's basically saying here, don't cheat people. Don't be a sneaky cheat. That's what it boils down to. Then there's a section that talks about the revenge on the Amalekites. And it says, blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. Then we get into chapter 26, giving the first fruits. The 10th in the third year, giving the first 10th of everything in the third year. And then there was a summary of the covenant. We get to chapter 27, and this is the laws written on stones. Now this stuff got really interesting to me. At the end of verse 2 it says, set up large stones and cover them with plaster. Write all the words of this law on the stones after you cross to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you. And then we skip ahead here to verse 4. When you have crossed the Jordan, you are to set up these stones on Mount Ebal. And I'm first thinking like, man, I wonder where those are today and if any of them survived. Well, guess what? There they are. This is the remnants. But, of course, this was Moses talking about this. But Moses didn't end up being the one that actually built this altar on Ebal. It was actually Joshua that built it, because Moses never entered the land of milk and honey, as God said he wouldn't. Now, all the words of this law in verses 1 through 4, it says, this probably comprised the 10 Commandments, which were to be written on the plastered stones on Mount Ebal, for example, in Sikkim. So the stones would have had the 10 Commandments written on them. And then I got to digging into this a little bit more, and then you got the covenant curses. Well, it's talked about Mount Gerizim, where the blessings would be shouted out, and then Mount Ebal is where these tribes would stand and deliver the curse and shout the curse. So I thought, okay, here's Mount Ebal, where's Gerizim? So I started looking this up, and here's a picture of Gerizim today. This is roughly what it looks like today. And the reason why it looks like it's all in rubble is these are the remains of multiple churches I found. It turns out that, yes, there was a temple built there, a Jewish temple. There was actually a Samaritan temple built there. It was knocked down. There was a Byzantine church built there, and then that was knocked down and destroyed. And then there was another church built on top of that. So what you're seeing here are the remains of multiple structures and multiple churches. Because what would happen throughout history is one group of people would move in, and they would basically take the religious church or the religious center and wipe it out and build their own religious center on it. And then when someone came through and defeated them, they would wipe their religious center out and put a temple up to their gods. So that's why what you're seeing here is multiple structures that are basically all rubble today. And then here's you a map. This kind of gives you an idea of where these are located. They said that Sikkim was in between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. So if you look right in the center of this map that says Samaria in green, just above it is Mount Gerizim. Then you see Sikkim just above that, just a little north of that. And just a little north of that you see Mount Ebal. So Sikkim did in fact sit in between those two mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. So I was interested in seeing that. And then of course we get through the section of covenant curses, and the very last verse says, anyone who does not put the words of this law into practice is cursed, and all the people will say amen. Now earlier when the words this law were used, it was referring to just the 10 Commandments. In this particular verse, the word this law is actually referring to the whole law, or the entire book of Deuteronomy is what it's looking for. The whole book of Deuteronomy. And that's it for today. So tomorrow is chapter 28 and chapter 29. And we will have another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Hit that like button, that subscribe button, and of course click the little jingle bell. so you can get notified the next time I upload a video, which will be tomorrow. And put something in the comment section if I skipped over something. I know I did summarize a lot and I did skip over a lot, so if something really stuck out to you, put it in those comments and we'll talk about it there. See you tomorrow.